Hi everyone, and welcome to the Museum of Natural and Cultural History's virtual discussion about the film The March, the Civil Rights Movement, and Past and Current White Nationalism in the United States. This is Lauren from the Museum of Natural and Cultural History, and I'd like to start this evening by recognizing that the museum and the University of Oregon are located on Kalapuya Alihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. We recognize and honor all Indigenous peoples who continue to call the Willamette Valley home. I'd also like to acknowledge that today is a day of mourning for George Floyd. Our hearts are with his family in their grief. The museum stands with Black communities and allies around the nation against police brutality and other forms of systemic racism. This evening, I am joined by 19 students from the University of Oregon Clark Honors College. They will share with you 4 group presentations on their research and scholarship from the course, The Rhetoric of the Civil Rights Movement and the Rise of Trumpist Romantic Populism, Beyond Polarization in the United States. Throughout the program, you, the viewers, can use the comment box on the Facebook live stream to reflect on the talk or add your thoughts, to engage with other viewers, and to ask questions. I'll be collecting your questions throughout the program, and we'll have time for questions after each group presentation and again at the end. I am also joined here this evening by Dr. Lesley-Anne Pittard and Dr. David Frank. We're so grateful to have Dr. Lesley-Anne Pittard here with us to open and frame this evening's program. Dr. Pittard has been a champion of equity, inclusion, and diversity in higher education for over 15 years and is currently Assistant Vice President for Campus and Community Engagement at the University of Oregon. In her role at the university, she identifies and strengthens key relationships with faculty, staff, and students on campus, as well as community organizations, local governments, and civic organizations, in ways that make equity, inclusion, and diversity commonplace at the University of Oregon and beyond. Also with us is Dr. David Frank, Professor of Rhetoric with the UO Clark Honors College. Dr. Frank's research and teaching interests feature deep rhetoric, that is, the study and practice of reason expressed in argumentation seeking justice. In 2018, Dr. Frank received an Andrew Mellon Fellowship to research and develop courses and exhibitions using UO alumnus James Blue's 1963 documentary, The March, to examine American history, racism, and anti-racism. Many thanks to both of you for joining us this evening. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Lesley-Anne Pittard.
Good evening. Thank you, Lauren, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Professor Frank, for inviting me to engage tonight during this very special program during a very special time. I would also like to thank everyone who has made this occasion possible, especially Anne Craig, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs at our Museum of Natural and Cultural History. Anne is a truly exceptional colleague, and Munch is one of our premier campus resources. I was invited to visit with you yesterday in class and remain in community with you this evening as you close your course, concluding at the intersection of a pivotal time in American history. A global pandemic has ravaged our nation, claiming more than 100,000 lives. There is no vaccine. A disproportionate amount of those lives lost are Black and brown. It has been reported that African Americans have suffered the worst generally, and our Latinx community has suffered the worst here in Oregon. Our ADPI, Asian, Desi, Pacific Islander, students, faculty, staff, and community members have been targeted by racial harassment and discrimination. Wearing a mask has become a dangerous political statement. And amidst it all, while quarantined at home, the names Ahmaud Arbery of Brunswick, Georgia, Breonna Taylor of Louisville, Kentucky, and George Floyd of Minneapolis, Minnesota, have erupted national protest, unrest, and action across our nation and the world. I listened to you yesterday and greatly appreciate your resilience, openness, ideas, and curiosity around how we move forward as a nation. I appreciated your interest in wanting me to speak specifically to how best to engage action and leverage the voice of the next generation. I also specifically heard you ask me to identify what exactly you can do right now in this moment. And for that, I offer you 3 opportunities layered as an analogy: a rose, a thorn, and a bud. Conceptualize the rose as an established form of action, the thorn as a challenge facing action, and the bud, something new and blossoming, intended to accelerate action. The rose, reconnect with the division of equity and inclusion. These aren't new issues, and we've been in the trenches. Have you? This isn't only Black and brown folk work. This is where our collective and difficult work is. This cannot be achieved by DEI alone or by asking our Black and brown peers and friends what to do. I am reminding you, especially my white students and peers, to refocus on self, reconnect, and make a lifelong commitment that extends across your natural life. One of our greatest DEI resources are campuses, strategies, and working groups. These are identity-based grassroots communities of students, faculty, and staff that facilitate change, community, and action. These groups have expanded, and in 2017, the Coalition of Allyship and Engagement, now renamed the Deconstructing Whiteness Working Group, needs your membership. Oregon, you are white. It is time to get into that identity label, own and unlearn, and be anti-racist. That is your work. It is time to get present and at the table, and until that remains, our collective progress is limited. The violent and racist history of Oregon alone directly correlates to why Black Lives Matter. The thorn, a challenge facing action. In DEI, we lead with an ethic of care. We are prioritizing institutional wellness, student success and access, faculty and staff engagement and retention, and climate and leadership. Consider those the thorns of campus, issues that persisted before and evolved amidst COVID. To tackle these issues, our ethic of care requires tough decisions. LACE is a modality that I offer to you. Right now, we need LACE more than ever. LACE stands for love, leading with kindness and reacting with patience, authenticity, allowing your unique essence and true self to shine through, courage, moving forward in the face of fear, and empathy, holding space for others. And lastly, the bud, something new and blossoming that accelerates action. And that's you, your voice, and your leadership. I quickly want to seed up an immediate opportunity for you, one that could influence the university and Oregon, today and generations beyond. Consider the use and imagery of the word pioneer. I am currently co-chair of a presidential task force, the Committee on Recognizing Our Diverse History. Since 2019, this committee has been developing recommendations around 4 issues: additions of plaques to be placed on campus buildings, statues, or artwork, the creation of new statues or other artwork recognizing people of diverse backgrounds, walking tours that allow an individual to see how campus has evolved, and to consider how those items can be incorporated into our academic mission of research, teaching, and service. This committee, however, has not been tasked to recommend the removal of existing artwork, statutes, or buildings. The committee has and continues to wrestle with what to do, in particular around the pioneer language and statues. I'd like to close by reminding you of what the term pioneer means, and have adopted elements of Mark Carpenter's talking points from a talk he gave from his research entitled Reconsidering the Pioneer Statue 100 Years Later. The Pioneer Statue was unveiled 100 years ago, last May. The Native American Student Union hosted a protest and demanded the statue be taken down. This 13-foot statue encapsulates Oregon's dark past. Joseph Teal, who funded it, was born into a wealthy Oregon family in the 1800s, a family that, end quote, illegally held slaves. To honor his father's legacy, Pimster Proctor was commissioned to capture an ideal pioneer. those responsible for the genocide and displacement of our indigenous communities referenced at onset of this program. When the statue was unveiled to the UO students on May 22nd, 1919, UO professor Harry Sheldon taught onlookers that pioneers conquered Oregon by sticking to their European heritage despite being surrounded by formidable savage enemies. The only sensible Indian policy was complete racial segregation. The pioneer is a proud Anglo-Saxon making war against the savages for the land. The word pioneer means a person who is among those who first enter or settled into a region. The Museum of Natural and Cultural History reminds us through artifacts and evidence that those settlers were not the first inhabitants of this land. Pioneer is a violent word that describes Oregon's violent past, which is seemingly displaced on our ideal campus. How can we march for justice for George Floyd in Pioneer Square? This is an Oregonian opportunity. If we celebrate this word uncritically, we are celebrating violence, dispossession, and genocide. We need your help and we need your voice. The current ASUO President and Chief of Staff contacted me this morning about this issue specifically, and I am under the impression they want to create a resolution regarding the statute's removal and reimagining of our pioneer language and imagery. ASUO needs your help and insight as we continue to address the past that enables our present. I will conclude my introduction and appreciate the opportunity to open the program. I will now transition to Professor Frank, who will introduce our students.
Thank you, Dr. Pittard. You will hear from 4 groups of students. They have gone back to the 1960s to study the efforts made by the federal government back in the 60s to ensure equal rights. And they have also investigated why, to a significant degree, these efforts have failed. The students that you will hear today have spent 10 weeks studying the civil rights movement, and they began by watching James Blue's 1963 film on the March on Washington. James Blue was a graduate of the University of Oregon, and the film went on to win 5 major international awards. The students also studied the rise of the Trump movement and the prospects for reconciliation. They have read books by Taylor Branch on the history of the civil rights movement. They have read a book by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Woodon on the conditions of poor whites in Yamhill County here in Oregon. And they finished the quarter by reading Ezra Klein's book on why we are polarized. As you hear the 4 groups, one group will feature in its discussion the 1964 War on Poverty. The second group will investigate the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The third group looks at the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the fourth group will consider the 1968 Fair Housing Act and reflect on these actions and consider the question, where are we now? And that's a good question, where are we? Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is perhaps the most prominent African-American writing today and who has expressed deep pessimism about racial reconciliation, stated yesterday, and I quote, "I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I see hope. I see progress right now. I see progress in the biracial protests taking place around the world." And Al Sharpton, in his eulogy for George Floyd today, announced plans for a March on Washington that will take place on August 28th, the anniversary of the original March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech. Al Sharpton stated that because on August 28th, the 57th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington will take place, and we're going to go back to Washington. We're going to go back to where King stated that he had a dream of racial reconciliation. We're going to go back to Washington, D.C. on August 28th to restore and recommit to that dream, Sharpton said, to stand up. Because just like at one era, we had to fight slavery, in another era, we had to fight Jim Crow, in another era, we had to fight voting rights. This is the era to deal with policing and criminal justice. And so Sharpton concluded, we need to go back to Washington on August 28th and stand up, Black, white, Latino, Arab, in the shadows of Lincoln and tell them this time it has to stop. And so I'm delighted then to introduce our first group that will consider and share with you their research on the war on poverty and what it means today. Group one.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Frank. Our group will examine the war on poverty then and now. So, the March on Washington in August of 1963 was a pivotal moment in American history in the fight for social justice and civil rights. The intentions were a push for jobs and freedom for African Americans and all minorities affected by injustice. The March on Washington brought many prominent African American figures together with a keynote speech from Dr. Martin Luther King about his dream for the American future. This gathering centered as a tone setter for the civil rights movement and the war on poverty. The need for economic equality started with the war on poverty, attacking key areas to decrease poverty, such as maintaining high unemployment, accelerating economic growth, fighting discrimination, improving regional economies, rehabilitating urban and rural communities, improving labor markets, expanding educational opportunities, improving the nation's health, and assisting the aged and disabled. Overall, the war on poverty was successful, but minorities are still struggling to be seen as equal. James Blue's movie, On the March on Washington, instilled an emotional response from our class, and describing it as awe-inspiring from the amount of attendees and how it blended the ideas of art and cultural together.
The war on poverty led to many consequences, both intended and unintended. Social aid programs such as Medicare and Medicaid, the Food Stamp Act, and the Office of Economic Opportunity were all results of the war on poverty, which was declared by Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. Additionally, there was an expansion of Social Security benefits for retirees, widows, the disabled, and college-age students. These programs aimed to increase access to services for those in poverty, and as a result, affected minority groups as well. In a time where access to services such as healthcare and education largely depended on the color of one's skin, these acts were an important step toward equality. The war on poverty also targeted education equality through the introduction of two acts, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and the Higher Education Act. As can be seen in this graph from a study done at UCLA, the percentage of Black students in intensely segregated minority schools in the South decreased almost 60% between 1968 and 1980. However, the number of Hispanic students steadily rose throughout this whole period. Additionally, much of the progress was reversed in the years after 1980. The Civil Rights Act was also passed after the declaration of the war on poverty. It was designed to outlaw discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It required equal access to public places and employment, and enforced desegregation of schools and the right to vote. While this act had the intention of creating equality throughout the country and certainly helped, there is still much work to be done before its efforts can be achieved. Like I mentioned before, some consequences of the war on poverty were also unintended. Namely, the war on poverty contributed to greater separation between the white and Black working class. While the fraction of African Americans in poverty has since decreased, there are still twice as many African Americans in poverty as whites. Overall, the war on poverty marked a significant effort towards change in the United States, but fell short in most areas that it tried to combat.
So after our study of the war on poverty, our group's focus shifted more towards modern political happenings, particularly the campaign and presidency of Donald Trump. And we noticed a couple key trends throughout our study of the rise of Trumpism. The first being these dramatic rollbacks that we saw in various programs without any sort of presentation of an adequate alternative. For example, one member of our group focused on how Trump executed several rollbacks on Obamacare to the detriment of public health. I think this is particularly important as we face the COVID crisis today, and it's super hard not to notice the glaring mishandlings of both preparation for and response to the pandemic. We also noticed that there are some major rollbacks on educational progress, including the current budget proposal, which suggests a $5.6 billion cut to the Department of Education, as well as an increasing push towards school voucher systems. And with some of these clear shortcomings of Trump's political career, we directed some of our attention to who exactly is still supporting Trump. And we found that Trump's campaign repeatedly singled out the white working class as its target demographic. Trump has sort of repeatedly proclaimed his dedication to advocating specifically for the white working class, and he's gained this immense traction with them throughout his career. And we noticed that despite this alleged favor of this demographic, several of the policies we discussed, such as cuts in education, actually restricted their ability to improve their status. And we wondered how this could be and what strategies of his were allowing him to maintain approval even with these controversies. So we decided to study Trump's rhetoric, and we found that his primary mode of dealing with these conflicts is through a sort of intense and improvisational racist and xenophobic rhetoric. And he uses this to explain economic failure, and he gets this sort of constant overexposure in the media to perpetuate these ideas. And this is pretty reflective of his primary rhetorical approach overall. He rejects everyone trying to change or modernize America and stokes the seeds of polarization and places blame for social degradation on minorities. And this unifies his audience and the demographic of the white working class behind him and channels all of their discontentment towards minority or other groups.
So as you can imagine, Trump's policies have created a lot of polarization in our society today, and I'm going to explain to you a few structural changes that could be made that might be able to alleviate some of this polarization. And that starts with deprivatizing education and healthcare. So making sure that the groups who are in charge of these things currently, so insurers and then maybe like private college institutions, don't have all the say when it comes to funding for these groups. These groups are more economically motivated and don't really take the best interests of the people needing those services to heart, and it creates a bigger gap between rich and poor and whites and minority groups. So prioritizing these groups is really important in reducing this polarization. And then looking to the system of the structure of our government, we have kind of a failed democracy because it's not creating a system of equality that our Constitution strives for. So imposing term limits on congressional representatives would be useful so that we don't have a monopoly in Congress, so we are able to filter out representatives and make sure that everyone's voice is being heard. And then in doing this, we'll hopefully get some more minority representation in Congress so that we can address other issues that are important to the Black community, Latino community, and so on. Also addressing donation regulations for Congress members. So Congress members are allowed to receive a lot of financial contributions, and then in turn they vote to support those contributors, and that leads to a lot of overlooking of minority groups, which could be avoided if we did have regulations. Additionally, we need more minority representation in Congress. Currently, California is the only state that has a Black Senate representative, and that's not okay. We need to have a lot more representation if we're going to be able to address issues that are facing the minority communities. And lastly, our two-party system traps our voters into a situation of not being able to vote for the candidate that they think would best suit the country because they might fear failure for that candidate, and they want to be able to vote for a candidate that's going to win. So overall, we need to have a lot of structural change if we're going to be able to overcome the polarization that we are currently facing.
So the war on poverty not only polarized our country between Democrats and Republicans, but also the war on poverty and Trumpism can encourage polarization between the white and Black working class communities. So in order to address this polarization in our personal lives and socially, one of the best programs for this is cultural competence training, and this can be applied from school and education to the regular workforce and healthcare. Cultural competency is defined as the ability to interact effectively with people of different cultures. And this consists of 4 different components: awareness of one's own cultural worldview, attitude toward cultural differences, and knowledge of different cultural practices and worldviews, and cross-cultural interpersonal skills. The goal is to have an ability to understand and communicate effectively with people across cultures. And this is shown to lead to a 15% decrease in miscommunication with others. This can be really relevant for people beyond employees. Cultural competency trainings are often, especially now during the epidemic, is offered online. Personal steps others can take are local classes and racial reconciliation workshops available via Zoom or other local organized groups. So our book by Ezra Klein also addressed another way to address having a less polarized. He said that the majority of people now cultivate a self-identity defined through opposition to other groups. And in order to alleviate this, we must work on cultivating a self-identity positively for oneself rather than in competition with others. And we must emphasize this togetherness rather than being manipulated by politicians, and create a unified identity. This tool, by cultivating a self-identity positively, can also be used to develop a more productive, empathetic response to things like privilege and bias. And we must realize that defensiveness in reaction to things like white privilege and polarization is usually weaponized by racist groups and leaders. Another thing that's really important to address polarization is to be able to have face-to-face and open conversation with those willing to listen or respond. And we also must recognize the validity of the concerns of the opposite side. For example, economics, healthcare, and healthcare are very real concerns from both Democrats, Republicans, and white and Black working classes. We have grown up in a world based in white supremacy, and this is not exclusive to political party. We must ask ourselves what we can better do to address our own privileges and bias in ourselves and others.
And to close, we would like to acknowledge the state of America, and going forward, discussing the ways to help can start with reaching out to friends and family within the minority community or those affected. Checking in will show that one cares and will allow for open communication and a safe place for a hard conversation to occur. Hard and uncomfortable conversations allow for each other to see their stance and hopefully come to an understanding. For ways to donate and support, we have provided links below that you'll be able to see. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Group 1. I really appreciate your presentation. As of right now, we don't have any questions coming in yet. So if you're out there listening and you have questions for this group, please go ahead and post those now in the comment feed. I'll kick us off with just one and see if any end up coming in. I was wondering if anyone wants to share what their biggest takeaway was from the course this term, and if anything particularly surprised you or left a lasting impression for you.
Well, something that I learned this term, I'm from Portland, Oregon, and you might know it's majority white people in the city, so I didn't really have a lot of background information at all in the civil rights movement, even after graduating high school, and I took AP US history, so you would think that was like a pretty major topic to be covered, but it wasn't. So after this class, I think I have like a much greater appreciation for the movement, and I also have realized that it's much more of an ongoing movement than I originally thought. I kind of always isolated it as this thing that happened in the 1960s, but now with like current events and after taking this class, I've realized that it's still a big ongoing movement.
Thank you, Rissa. Anyone else have anything they'd like to add? Okay. Thanks, group one.
Thank you, Rissa. You made me cry. So I appreciate that. Group two investigated the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And again, what we are trying to do here is to go back to the 60s to see what happened to the major efforts taken by the federal government to combat racism and what lessons we might fetch out of the experience of the 60s for this present moment, because we are hearing, for good reason, significant calls for structural change. And the kinds of structural change that were attempted in the 1960s didn't go as well as we had hoped. And so by investigating the history of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we can learn perhaps about what we might do in 2020. So group two.
Alrighty, so we are the 1964 Civil Rights Act group, and as you may be familiar with, the 1964 Civil Rights Act was essentially the most direct outcome of the March on Washington, making it particularly pertinent to this discussion. And in talking about this today, I originally wanted to walk us all through some of the rhetoric that led up to the March on Washington and how different rhetorical strategies of the long civil rights movement blended together in contradiction, but ultimately to create a powerful document, although it has many failings. And I realized that I think I would rather take us back to view this rhetoric by having us listen to Black activists themselves. And so today I've included a link from part of Malcolm X's speech on Letter to the Grassroots, and particularly to our viewers and listeners who are white or who are non-Black people of color. I encourage you in listening to the speech to consider if in current events you are diluting the message of your local Black community, or if you are a part of the solution to help uplift their voices. And with that, I think we'll turn it over to Malcolm X. Zach, I think you might need to play it through your speakers.
My apologies, 1 second.
What you do, you integrate it with cream. But a rabbi and an old white preacher. Yes, an old white preacher. The same white element that put Kennedy in power, labor, the Catholics, the Jews, and liberal Protestants. Same clique that put Kennedy in power joined the March on Washington. It's just like when you got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What you do, you integrate it with cream. You make it weak. If you pour too much cream in, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot, it becomes cool. It used to be strong, it becomes weak. It used to wake you up, now it'll put you to sleep. This is what they did with the March on Washington. They joined it. They didn't integrate it, they infiltrated it. They joined it, became a part of it, took it over. And as they took it over, it lost its militancy. They ceased to be angry. They ceased to be hot. They ceased to be uncompromising. Why, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. You had one right here in Detroit. I saw it on television with clowns leading, white clowns and black clowns. I know you don't like what I'm saying, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because I can prove what I'm saying. If you think I'm telling you wrong, you bring me Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and James Farmer and those other three, and see if they'll deny it over a microphone. No, it was a sellout. It was a takeover. When James Baldwin came in from Paris, they wouldn't let him talk because they couldn't make him go by the script. Burt Lancaster read the speech that Baldwin was supposed to make. They wouldn't let Baldwin get up there because they know Baldwin liable to say anything. They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, how to come, where to stop, what sign to carry, what song to sing, what speech they could make and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown. And every one of those Toms were out of town by sundown. Now, I know you don't like my saying this, but I can back it up. It was a circus, a performance. It beat anything Hollywood could ever do. The performance of the year. Ruther and those other three devils should get an Academy Award for the best actors because they acted like they really loved Negroes and fooled a whole lot of Negroes. And the 6 Negro leaders should get an award, too, for the best supporting cast.
Thank you, Zach. So especially listening to the speech, I think is important now as we consider a second March on Washington, particularly again for white allies and non-Black people of color. It's very important to help uplift the message that our Black friends want us to be speaking on and to try to not perform this performative form of activism. And if you go back to the slide, Zach, despite these relevant criticisms, there was a significant conclusion from the March on Washington that has helped our nation to overcome some of the de jure racism, and that's been the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Zach, are you screen sharing?
Yes. Oh.
So the 1964 Civil Rights Act had some very lofty goals, and the main one has been segregation, followed by voting rights, desegregating areas of the nation for federal funding, and overcoming discrimination of the workforce. And like I said, those are very lofty goals. So oversight was also an important part of this document. And looking at it, you would think that these are problems of the past. However, my group members today are going to be discussing how a lot of these problems that the 1964 Civil Rights Act aimed to solve have largely, unfortunately, been continued into today. And I encourage you all, especially as we consider a second March on Washington, to think about how we need to make institutional changes to make these changes real and permanent.
Observation of Southern schools from 1964 to the present can provide a comprehensive summary of how modern segregation came to be. When Title IV was implemented, it resulted in a 77.8% of Black students in intensely segregated schools dropping to 23%, as you can see on the graph. This decreasing trend ends in 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan and has slowly increased ever since. Comparatively, Hispanic students in intensely segregated schools experienced no drop from the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and instead their trends have slowly increased over the years to the present. I argue that this suggests that the individuals enforcing Title IV possess racist motivations and were able to expose loopholes in Title IV's rhetoric, ultimately resulting in an education system that is rooted with racist undertones. The first loophole in Title IV relates to differences in desegregation in the North and South. The South was the main focus of desegregation because of the outright racist backlash to the civil rights movement that the region experienced. This allowed court cases like Milliken versus Bradley to slip out of the public eye and establish Supreme Court rulings in the North. In Milliken v. Bradley, the court ruled that local control of schools should remain autonomous and the process of desegregation did not require any racial balance in each school grade or classroom. This meant that segregation could culminate based on circumstance in public schools, depending on how much of one race lived in one area. Additionally, the White Citizens Council began creating all-white private schools, exposing the loophole in Title IV that said public school desegregation was necessary to receive federal funding. Private schools, being non-federally funded, could essentially evade this requirement and again separate white students into all-white schools. These private schools also had complete autonomous control over the curriculum and ideological content of their school system, furthering racist belief and ideology. Finally, lack of effect of Title IV on Hispanic students demonstrates that the motivations of those enforcing Title IV did not concern combating racism, but rather were concerned with exploiting weaknesses in the title. This solidified racist undertones within the system that can still be seen in effect today. Since Hispanics were not the face of the civil rights movement, they did not receive its benefits because legislators knew there'd be no publicity and therefore no repercussions for ignoring the population. In our capitalist society, education is meant to act as the great equalizer of economic class. If you work hard and exhibit mental proficiency, theoretically you should climb economically. But this system is rigged and does not work this way. Economic burden congregates minorities into similar regions, segregating public schools that are funded based on local property tax. This means that poor minority areas will have poorly funded education systems. And in the midst of our current climate, the turmoil of police violence, protesting, and looting often blinds us from the purpose of public outcry. There is systematic implementation of economic looting from the poor by the wealthy. This is a broken complex that traps people disproportionately based on the color of their skin. This is a violation of justice for Black and Brown Americans and other minorities, and is the fuel for the fire of protest and the reason that change must occur.
So, let's see. I assume people can hear me. I'm going to assume people can hear me. So in addition to trying to desegregate schools, one of the other big goals for the Civil Rights Act was also to remove discrimination in the workforce and try to bridge the gap in terms of opportunity for white and Black Americans alike. And so to do so, the language of the Civil Rights Movement was pretty explicit in banning discrimination in terms of who you could hire based on race. And since the Civil Rights Movement, there's been significant improvements to bridging the gap both in wages and in workforce opportunity and employment. However, even today, there are still attempts made to try and bridge that gap because obviously we're not at a perfectly equal divide in terms of workforce opportunity equality. And so a more recent bill that was passed a few years ago called Ban the Box that some of you may remember was aimed at trying to address one of the issues with employment disparities for race. And the biggest issue is that with employment, one issue that sort of creeps its way into employment is sort of differences in how the African-American community is unfairly incarcerated at a much greater rate than white Americans. And as a result, when they try to re-enter the workforce, one large blockade that they encounter is because they have a criminal record, it puts them at a great disadvantage trying to find new jobs in the workforce. And so as a way to try and counteract that additional barrier to an already disenfranchised community, a lot of states introduced what's called Ban the Box, which was a restriction that prevented employers from asking job applicants for their criminal history. And the idea was that if you remove that question, it would remove that sort of additional bias that prevents African Americans from trying to get jobs relative to white Americans. And while this seemed like a really promising law to try and help remove some of the discrimination in the workforce, what actually happened is that it actually had the opposite effect. And the ban-the-box policies ended up actually decreasing the percentage of African Americans being hired in the workforce. And a lot of people were really scratching their heads as to why this was the case, because obviously this law was designed to actually help African Americans in the workforce. And upon further inspection about, you know, the consequences and the trends, what they found is that employers were really invested in criminal history in terms of hiring, which, you know, is a pretty understandable factor in terms of trying to choose the best applicant for a job. And because they removed that question, what it was causing employers to do was sort of guess as to who, you know, which applicants may or may not have criminal histories, and whether or not these employers were aware of it. What they were subconsciously doing was negatively, you know, scoring African American applicants by assuming subconsciously that they had a criminal history as it compared to white applicants. And so, you know, before they had a very explicit set of information that said whether or not these applicants had a criminal history, but now they were being forced to guess. And what this caused them to do is subconsciously use some of what I call unconscious discrimination to choose between their applicants. And this is what resulted in a significant decrease in the hiring of African Americans while the ban-the-box policies were in place. And so, you know, this is one key piece of evidence, and I think there are lots of other important pieces of evidence today about how unconscious discrimination has really become, in my opinion, the forefront of the battle for, you know, equal rights for the, you know, all minorities, but obviously the African American community. And so I have this image here to show you sort of what I believe is, you know, the real problem. You know, we see today a lot of these sort of, you know, questionable opinions about, say, you know, the All Lives Matter retort to the Black Lives Matter movement. As I mentioned previously, the decreased hiring of African Americans sort of, you know, we don't fully understand why that's the case. And a lot of, you know, even though we have banned discrimination in the workforce, as well as, you know, I also wanted to include the build the wall part of Trump's presidential campaign, because all of these movements, what they all have in common is that they all stem from the sort of unconscious discriminatory motivation where, you know, African Americans are perceived to be you know, criminals or have criminal backgrounds, or, you know, Mexican immigrants are perceived to have, you know, be drug dealers or have also criminal backgrounds. And, you know, all of these sort of subconscious beliefs are fueling what we see today in a lot of our discriminatory actions. And so looking forward to try and confront these issues and try to make further improvements. Unconscious discrimination, in my opinion, is the greatest problem that we need to focus on in terms of bringing a greater equality to America.
Alrighty, so I'm going to close out our group by talking about the roots of polarization and specifically how we can look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 partially as the root of the polarization that that Group 1 talked about very eloquently. So if we go all the way back to 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed, we know that that election that same year was contested between Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, and Barry Goldwater, a Republican. Neither of them are on the screen right now. I'll make that note. Goldwater was handily beaten in that election by Lyndon Johnson, but Goldwater's campaign was the first time that the Republican nominee successfully gained that nomination running on an anti-civil rights, effectively a fundamentally openly racist platform. The next presidential election after that was in 1968. And that is when that platform actually won the Republicans' presidential election. And that was with Richard Nixon, who you can see here. And the man to the left, pictured just to the left of Richard Nixon, is Kevin Phillips, sorry. And Kevin Phillips was one of Nixon's most important campaign strategists. And he, basically what he did was he looked at demographic trends, statistics, analytics, much like what we do now in politics, and saw how the Civil Rights Act had inflamed such anger and resentment among white working class people in America that that Nixon's election was basically founded on a backlash against the Civil Rights Act. So actually Kevin Phillips wrote an article in the New York Times back in 1969, and I'll read a few quotes from it. He says that the outer Southerners who live in the Ozark and the Appalachian mountain ranges and in the Piedmont upcountry, and now in urban, suburban Florida and Texas, have always had different interests than the plantation owners of the Black Belt. It's a less extreme conservative group. It adheres with other Republican constituencies across the country and can be appealed to without fragmenting the coalition. So when you're after the political converts, you start with the less extreme, wait for the extremists to come into line when their alternatives collapse. And basically what Phillips envisioned for the Republican Party was an alliance of working class white people with European immigrants who built up racial resentment during the civil rights movement. And you can see on this map on the right that that's the electoral map he anticipated, the emerging Republican majority, he called it. And what was so pioneering about Phillips' electoral map, or his predicted map in 1969, is that it correlates very, very nicely with Trump's electoral map in 2016. So you can see that the Deep South there was the emerging bastion of the Republican Party, as with the Rust Belt, which you can see on that map. So if you switch the slide, we can see that Donald Trump's victory in 2016 came in large part from those dark red states in the Rust Belt, as well as the other red states down in the South. And I know that for me, at least on election night 4 years ago, even as a high school student, I'd looked at all the predictions, I'd looked at all the maps, and Clinton was projected to win in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and even in Florida, and definitely in Michigan and Wisconsin, and she won in none of those states, and that was a big shock. But I think that if we look back in time to the Civil Rights Act, and specifically the conservative backlash against the Civil Rights Act, even in the 1960s, we can see how Trump's victory and the way that it maps onto our society demographically and ideologically has been decades in the making. And as much of a shock as that was when Donald Trump won in 2016, this has been the mission of the Republican Party since the 1960s, to build an electoral coalition based fundamentally on racial animosity against the civil rights movement and against other gains made by people of color, and especially Black Americans in the United States. And so going into the protest movements that we're seeing today, it's one thing that we need to obviously think about. And while I support protests in almost all forms, if they're led by the people who they're for, then I support any kind of protest that's happening. But it's important to note that the protests of the 1960s, in some sense, though they created legislative progress, they, once the moderate white activists who marched in the Freedom Summers and in the cities in 1968, once they sort of moved on, that gave way to 30 years of Republican dominance in the political system that rolled back every meaningful achievement of the Civil Rights Act, barring resegregating, but as Zach showed and as George has showed, that's not exactly true either. So yeah, it's been a long time in the making, and that's the point I want to make. So finally, yeah, other groups have talked about it, of course, but advocating for George Floyd. The most important thing is to listen to Black leadership and donate to those bail funds and Black organizations. Those are the people who are, apologies, that was the train, people who are organizing these protests and actually are getting things done. And for people like me and for the majority of people in this class, and probably the majority of people watching this live stream, it's our job to listen, to donate, and to educate ourselves. It's not the responsibility of our friends who are people of color or Black Americans to educate us on what we can do and what it means to be, there we go again, be either consciously or unconsciously racist. That's, not their responsibility. It's on us to educate ourselves. And finally, unless your life is maybe in imminent danger, do not call the cops on Black people. I think at this point, it's important to recognize that most police forces are not necessarily in it to protect or to serve, especially not in it to protect or to serve Black Americans. And it's on us to make sure that we're doing that instead.
Thank you so much, Group 2. So if anyone out there who is watching on Facebook has questions for Group 2, please do post them now. And we do have one that we can start with, and it kind of relates a little bit to the polarization of our country and the map that you showed. Someone is asking, with congressional reps who are vested in staying in power, how can we ever possibly pass term limits, find ways to limit donations, and make changes to the two-party system? And I'll add this part, do you think that kind of a change could have an impact on the politics of our country and the issues we're seeing with polarization today?
Well, I would agree with Group 1 in that those changes would absolutely have a meaningful impact on our political system and would reduce the extreme polarization we see now. My concern is that because of the history, because of what's happened since 1964, because of this history of polarization in the second half of the 20th century, I think that those changes would be pretty much impossible under our existing political system, because the last 50 years of our political system have operated specifically to build an almost indestructible Republican control over the ways we think and argue about issues politically, because it's all been founded on a backlash to civil rights gains.
Thanks so much, Aiden. We haven't had any other questions coming in just yet, so I will just ask one more and go back to the question that I asked Group 1 rather, sorry. I'm wondering if anyone would like to share what their biggest takeaway was from the course this term, or if there was anything that left a lasting impression with you that you'll remember for a long time.
Yeah, like Risa said before, I also haven't really had a background in these kind of topics before, really at all, even from my past education. And I think that this class has really opened up a lot of different ways of thinking for a lot of people that are in it. I think that's really important for thinking about how we can go about the future.
Thanks, George. It looked like, Rachel, maybe you had a comment. You had unmuted yourself for a moment. Sorry to put you on the spot if you didn't.
That's okay. I was just thinking, what I will remember for this class is that we've been through some really hard times together, and we've been through just a very challenging time for our nation. And I have felt grateful to have my peers and Professor Frank to give us an outlet to discuss and be somewhat productive, and to really process what's going on right now is something I will always appreciate, and that I hope to bring forward in my own life.
Thank you so much. So we'll leave it there now for Group 2. And we will have David come back on and introduce Group 3.
Terrific job, Groups 1 and 2. And again, we are working through the 4 major initiatives in the 1960s, beginning with the 1964 War on Poverty that Lyndon Johnson initiated, and then the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So the third group studied the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And given this is an election year, you will find that their analysis will be quite important for this moment. So Group 3.
All right. So as he mentioned, we're dealing with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But before we really get to the act, what I'm going to talk about, if you want to go to the next slide, is the social structure that the act was actually moving upon. And to understand the state of the Black vote in 1965, we have to go all the way back to the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So, the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, that putatively would have made race a non-factor for voting requirements. And there's an argument to be made that for a period, really until the redemption period, that was mostly successful. While the federal government was enforcing Reconstruction in the South, you did see a lot of enfranchisement of Black Americans. And the effects of that, you can see even just statistically in like 1,300 Black Americans holding office, ranging from school boards to governor, between 1866 and 1880. And there were material gains that were made during this time too. Literacy rates were up, access to education was way higher, clean drinking water was also way up. But then we have a political compromise, which comes when Rutherford B. Hayes needs essentially the Southern Coalition to ratify his election. And the compromise that he makes is the federal government will stop enforcing Reconstruction and hand the South back to the Southern states and to that coalition in Congress, but most importantly, to allow the localities to deal with it. And that period is what was referred to as redemption in the South. And that's when you start to see literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and the effective re-disenfranchisement of Black Americans. And I think it's a prescient moment to consider today, when very soon we are going to be talking about compromise and political prudence, and you're gonna hear that. And it's important to remember that these political compromises that seem prudent to us have been marshaled to enact, elongate, and entrench material violence against Black Americans. But anyway, that's the situation that the Voting Rights Act was addressing.
Yeah, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 banned the use of the literacy test in 7 southern states, allowing more people, particularly people of color, to vote. With more people voting, politicians needed to gain support in more locations than before. This meant redistributing state funds to help communities that needed more support for education, or even things like roads. Improving public resources was one of the least controversial things a politician could do to gain the Black vote. Politicians also had to stop using extreme racial rhetoric in order to not alienate an entire group of voters. As extreme outward racism was used less by state and community leaders, the general public also saw a reduction. As people of color saw improved economic status, so did some white people. Biracial coalitions started to form as people realized that the inclusion of people of color benefited everyone. Martin Luther King Jr. was present at the signing ceremony of the Voting Rights Act by President Lyndon B. Johnson. A couple years prior, MLK called for real democracy in his I Have a Dream speech. The Voting Rights Act allowed more Americans to actually participate in our democracy. But if you read or listen to his entire speech made at the March on Washington, you'll notice that a large part of it is an economic appeal. King called for an equal share of America's funds. The Voting Rights Act helped bring this closer to reality. King made it clear in his speech that the destinies of both white people and Black people are intertwined. As public resources improved in impoverished areas, the benefits were seen across races. As people of color started to experience a better economy, so did white people. Biracial coalitions formed, and people of different races worked together and both benefited. However, when the economy started to face difficulties, there was a shift in the economic and political atmospheres in the South. Biracial coalitions started to collapse. People of different races stopped working together. Extreme racial rhetoric started to return. Since the 90s, America has become more polarized and more separated than it was when we recognized the truth in King's words. Their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
I wasn't unmuted. Sorry. So as my colleagues have said, that the formation of these biracial coalitions based on mutual interests actually created great prosperity, not only for Black Americans, but for white Americans as well. And the one of the main outcomes of increased voting, increased voters, was that Black elected officials occupied more state legislatures and more state and even regional offices. And for example, when Atlanta elected their first Black mayor in 1973, Black employment rose from 38 to 56%. But not only were these changes helping Black Americans, they were also helping white Americans, because white Americans had lived and worked under the operation of these very strong institutions and structures that were upheld by white business owners who were very powerful and very rich. So the inclusion of Black people and the Black community into the voting base allowed for more money to be spent on public services and encouraged these biracial coalitions. However, unfortunately, they did not last long. As you can see in this graph, in 1994, President Bill Clinton passed the North American Free Trade Agreement. And the North American Free Trade Agreement opened up the US economy to global markets. And so, because the Southern economy was largely based on industrial production, in North Carolina, you can see how it takes a very steep fall, and that is because they were primarily textile producers. And so when the economy opened up to these global markets, the industry of the South began to collapse. And after that, there was less of a reason to cooperate across races because the pursuit of mutual interest was not as easy as it had been. And this was again further amplified in 2001 when China was accepted into the World Trade Organization, which further opened up and liberalized US economies, and the industrial South suffered even heavier losses. So as we look at today and we look at how we have come to the time we have come and with the leaders we have, I think it is important to understand that while there are deep issues of ideology and racism and ignorance, these issues are amplified and exacerbated and perpetuated by economic disenfranchisement as well. So the first equality we need is racial equality. But in order to maintain it, in order to sustain it, we also need to aspire to have some economic equality. And then just a final point, we can see, if I can draw your attention down to this bottom graph, in 1994, you can see the parties began to switch. And it was Democratic President Bill Clinton who passed it. And as my group has explained, the Voting Rights Act had more Democrats elected to these offices. So while they were experiencing hardship, they looked around to see their leaders, and that was one of the many factors that played into this switch of parties. And then, so yeah, thank you.
As my classmates have already mentioned, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 resulted in increases in economic equality for Black citizens in the United States. Prior to the Voting Rights Act, Black workers suffered economically at the hands of voter disenfranchisement and segregation. Improvement of socioeconomic equality is a fair measure of the effectiveness of the Voting Rights Act due to the documented causal relationship between political power and economic status. The increase in Black voters following the Voting Rights Act, especially in counties and states with large and compact Black populations, created a larger incentive for politicians to consider the needs for this demographic, including prioritizing equal access to employment opportunities for African Americans, which was a central political concern of the Civil Rights Movement. Econometric studies have concluded that the Voting Rights Act increased the likelihood of Black employment in the public sector and decreased the racial wage gap in this part of the market by about 5.5% between 1965 and 1980. The results for Black participation in the private sector are less conclusive, but the theory predicts that the improvement in equality in the public sector would pressure the private sector to follow suit. Despite decreases in the racial wage gap in the 15 years following the Voting Rights Act, there have been minimal improvements since. In 2015, there was still a significant wage gap between Black and white workers. Of male workers with bachelor's degrees in the United States, Black workers earned approximately 80% as much as their white counterparts. According to the Pew Research Center, there has not been any reduction in the racial wage gap since 1980 for this demographic. It is important to note that a large part of this stagnation is due to the fact that there has not been any improvements in hourly wages for white, Black, and Hispanic men during this 35-year time period. This freeze in wages surpasses the issue of the racial wage gap and racial economic inequality. It speaks to the rising income inequality in the United States following Ronald Reagan's election. Even though the problem of income inequality is not solely a racial issue, it is important to recognize that African Americans are more likely to be adversely affected by this trend due to the inequality that was already present in 1980. Since the 1960s, there has been a shift in how racial discrimination occurs at the polls. The barriers to voting have changed from literacy tests and poll taxes to political gerrymandering and at-large voting. These new methods of voter suppression allow minorities to vote, but also ensure that their votes are drowned out by the white vote. Despite these new methods of voter suppression, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg stated that the Voting Rights Act has been successful in thwarting such efforts up until 2013. In 2013, the Supreme Court case of Shelby v. Holder repealed Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, which outlined which states needed federal oversight for any changes to state voting procedures. Striking down this section of the Voting Rights Act allows states to redraw voting districts without the supervision of the federal government, and effectively removes the VRA's ability to prevent modern forms of voter suppression. Overall, the Voting Rights Act did modestly improve economic equality in the United States, but it was short-term and did not come close to eliminating it. With the repeal of Section 4, the Voting Rights Act becomes yet another piece of legislation that looks good on paper, but is largely ineffective at preventing modern forms of discrimination at the polls.
By understanding the relationship between the Voting Rights Act and its impact on society, we can learn to create and sustain a biracial coalition, one that can better ground voting rights and reach out to the disenfranchised poor whites in order to develop a truly intersectional vision of justice. The first step to build a biracial coalition is to stop the spread of polarization. Since the 2016 election, the Democrat and Republican Party have grown more distant than ever, with both sides unable to compromise on various issues. This polarization has also led to an increase in hateful clashes between Trump supporters and others, creating a continuous cycle of hate and division. The Voting Rights Act was able to sustain a biracial coalition because people supported unifying themes such as economic development and education, which helped boosted local economies. We need to unite the people once more. Therefore, we must maintain respectful interactions with others and create communication channels and forums for dialogue to build a working level of trust rather than further driving a wall between those who hold different beliefs than us. In doing so, instead of fighting between ourselves, we can work together to put political pressure on elected candidates to fund economic development programs that benefit the people in general. Legislative steps that would better ground voting rights include, first, fully restoring the Voting Rights Act by overturning the Shelby case. Second, all states should have an easier means to vote and should follow Oregon's vote by mail option because, as Ezra Klein says, quote, "The harder you make it to vote, the surer it is that only the most polarized Americans end up at the polls," end quote. Third, we need to get rid of filibusters to encourage compromise within both parties. Lastly, we should change the electoral votes to electoral points and reward each candidate a percentage of points based on the percentage of popular votes received in each state. This would eliminate the winner-take-all system, thus allowing for all votes to count, which would also increase voter turnout. Thanks for listening. I would just like to conclude, similarly to the other groups before us, the importance of being allies in the Black Lives Matter movement, and our role in educating others in a respectful manner.
Thank you so much, Group 3. There is a little bit of a delay, so I will encourage people watching to post their questions as soon as possible for Group 3. We do have one that came in at the very beginning of your presentation, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to address this if you talked about it in class, but if you did, someone is wondering if you could speak to the correlation between the Indian Wars and redemption. And if you did not discuss it in class, that is okay too.
I don't know about my peers. I personally don't feel well equipped to speak on that.
No problem. So your group was assigned the Voting Rights Act, so we'll get a little bit closer to home for you. We still don't have any questions, but I was wondering if someone could speak to the turning back, or the Supreme Court case that overturned some of the enforcement mechanisms of the Voting Rights Act, and what effects you think that might have on this coming election in our current COVID-19 world.
So the repeal of Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act, while one of the main reasons that it was repealed is a number of the justices on the Supreme Court argued that we were moving into a post-racial society, which obviously due to current events is absolutely not true. But they felt that it was no longer necessary to punish that, and it was punishing those states for their crimes in the past. And so basically it's saying that they don't have to get federal oversight for any changes in redistricting, and it has been shown that there is redistricting that's happening, and political gerrymandering and at-large voting does suppress the vote of, I'm going to say the minority, but what's happening is the politicians are trying to drown out what would probably be the majority in their states to maintain their political power. And I think, personally, I feel that that would be a threat to hearing how the people actually feel about the 2020 election.
Thank you. We haven't had any questions yet, so I will just go ahead and turn it back over to David, and we'll see if any questions come in for group 3 that we can ask at the end.
Thank you, group 3, and I'm hopeful people watching are seeing a recurring pattern, and that is the war on poverty started in 1964 was not as successful as it should have been because it was gutted, and then again the 1964 Civil Rights Act was not effectively implemented after the election of Ronald Reagan. And then the 1965 Voting Rights Act, as Dylan and others have discussed, did not fully achieve its aspirations because it was challenged by administrators who were not going to implement it. And then the Supreme Court decision in Shelby really gutted the enforcement mechanisms. And I don't think you'll be surprised by group 4, who will discuss the last major civil rights legislation of the 1960s, and that's the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and the aspiration it had to guarantee equal rights regarding housing. And so you'll hear now from group number 4.
Thank you, Professor Frank. Tonight, my group will be presenting on the history of the Fair Housing Act and how it has progressed since its passage. When our group watched The March by James Blue, we found that the film aimed to show whites and blacks working together to protest the inequality Black Americans face in the United States. The Civil Rights Act of '64 ended segregation in public places, and the act in '65 allowed Black Americans to have their political voices heard. However, even after those acts, the American population would return to their homes in segregated neighborhoods. We see in James Blue's film people of all races protesting together, but until the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, white and Black Americans could not live together. With the passage of the Fair Housing Act, America hoped to finally integrate the most fundamental part of our lives, where we live and who our neighbors are. It's been just over 52 years since President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1968 into law. Commonly known as the Fair Housing Act, the legislation was the culmination of the 3 acts passed during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Yet before 1968, there was little hope the Fair Housing Act would be passed, as fair housing programs were explicitly left out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. In 1966, President Lyndon B. Johnson attempted to pass fair housing regulations with his proposed Civil Rights Act. However, Southern Democrats called the act unconstitutional. The legislation failed to gain support in the 89th Congress and thus died that year. Again, members of the government proposed similar fair housing provisions in 1967, but the legislation died in a committee before reaching the congressional floor. It wasn't until the events in early spring of 1968 that led to the passage of the Fair Housing Act.
In providing additional context for the Fair Housing Act, I'm going to be talking about political assassinations and civil unrest. 1968 was a notable year in the civil rights movement, not only because of the policy that came out of it, but also because it was the year Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. After political assassinations, some campaigns like the Memphis Sanitation Workers Strike find success, while others like the SCLC Poor People's Campaign do not. There are a couple reasons why. But first, for some background, on February 1st, 1968, outdated equipment crushed and killed 2 sanitation workers in Memphis. Following that, over 1,000 sanitation workers went on strike demanding a union. Despite the support from Martin Luther King and other prominent individuals and organizations, the striking workers did not seem to be making any progress. After King's assassination in April, riots broke out across America. This political violence affected the success of the strike by pressuring the city of Memphis to take action. This flow chart here on the right, made by sociologists Claire Whittingell and Joe Fretwell, maps the causal connections between events leading up to the strike's resolution. It tracks the riots that came out of the assassination and the looting of businesses in Memphis to business leaders demanding the city do something. And ultimately, the pressure coming from all sides forced the mayor to sign a memorandum. The Poor People's Campaign did not experience the same success, in part because it was over-reliant on the charismatic leadership of Martin Luther King. Some historians have analyzed the evolving relationship between leaders and followers along the Memphis sanitation workers strike's timeline and have argued, as I do, that the strike succeeded because it was grounded not in a single leader like the Poor People's Campaign was, but rather in the workers. So what can we learn from this? This is a photo that I took 2 days ago here in Portland. We haven't had a riot since last Friday, but the violence from the police has been unrelenting. Across the country, there has been a lot of discussion about riots and about what is and is not an acceptable means of resisting injustice. After the murder of George Floyd, protests and riots have taken place in every state. Mayors have issued curfews. Some have called in the National Guard. It's important to remember that all of these events also happened in 1968 in Memphis and across the country. Martin Luther King was famously opposed to violent protest, but he also observed that a riot is the language of the unheard. And I want to briefly read the rest of that quote. He said, a riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the past few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. It has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. So in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. I think those words are as true today as they were then. And what we should learn from 1968 is that not only is a riot a natural response to a system of injustice, but in some cases, this righteous expression of anger can force change, as it did for the Memphis sanitation workers.
I'm going to be talking about some of the successes and failures of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Before the passing of the 1968 Fair Housing Act, white sellers, brokers, and landlords faced a strong social pressure to discriminate, whether or not they wanted to. Though the act did not overcome this problematic attitude as a whole, it did initially force American society to take a step in the right direction. It compelled a nationwide consideration of the outlandish racist rhetoric that was penetrating the housing market in the 1960s, and relieved any pressure that people felt to comply with this standard. The first major roadblock preventing the success of the Fair Housing Act of 1968 was the systematic removal of the enforcement mechanisms under the Dirksen Compromise, and this meant that its lofty goals would be hard to achieve in practice. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development had 30 days to investigate any claim of discrimination and decide whether or not to pursue the allegations. Even if the investigation revealed that the victim had experienced outright discrimination, the agency had no means to gain compliance, give a solution, assess the damage, prohibit the discriminatory practices from continuing, or chastise the lawbreaker in any fashion. In addition to the enforcement mechanisms roadblocking the success of the FHA, various presidents took steps to prevent its success. In January of 1969, George Romney was elected to be the secretary of the HUD. He was the first administrator to attempt to take action and implement the policies demonstrated by the 1968 Fair Housing Act. He proposed an open communities program with the vision of opening up new, non-segregated housing options that would contribute to decreasing the effects of past housing discrimination. Unfortunately, President Nixon was not on board with this operation taking place under Romney and stated that, quote, "This country is not ready at this time for either forcibly integrated housing or forcibly integrated education." He proceeded to fire Secretary Romney and put an end to the Open Communities program. Nearly 40 years later, the Obama administration decided that more action was needed to further racial equality in America and announced a new rule that would be added as an addition to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. The new rule aimed to provide data and tools to communities receiving HUD funding to help them achieve the fair housing goals and standards set before them. These communities would now be required to analyze factors that may be contributing to the barriers that still existed and to formulate a remedy to these factors. The main targets of the new law were the over 20 cities across the nation that still remained hyper-segregated coming into the year 2010. Unfortunately, the Trump administration overlooked this rule and decided not to look at it again until the year 2020.
I will be discussing Trump's history with the Fair Housing Act, specifically his work rolling back the aspects of the act that have made it effective. In 1972, 5 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, Trump was sued for violating the act. The Nixon administration brought charges against the Trump Management Corporation. Federal officials discovered evidence confirming these allegations, as Trump had been refusing to rent to Black tenants and lying to Black applicants about the availability of apartments. Trump fought the case for 2 years, arguing that the federal government was trying to make him rent to welfare recipients. He eventually pleaded guilty in order to settle the lawsuit. Trump signed a settlement that required him to place ads in newspapers saying that he welcomed Black applicants and to agree to no longer discriminate against renters of color. Trump was elected president nearly 50 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. 3 years into his presidency, Black home ownership rates dropped to a record low since 1950. The Trump administration's effort to roll back two of the Fair Housing Act's most important principles, the disparate impact rule and the affirmatively furthering fair housing, is reflected in this drastic statistic. These two principles were implemented in an effort to combat less overt forms of discriminatory housing practices that continued beyond the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The disparate impact rule is a policy that was enacted under the Obama administration in order to further prevent discriminatory practices and policies from disproportionately affecting a group due to their race. It also allows a person to challenge practices that have disproportionately adverse effects on those protected by the Fair Housing Act. Despite all of this, the Trump administration issued a proposed regulation that would impose nearly impossible requirements on those striving to bring a disparate impact claim to court, leaving millions of people in America more vulnerable to housing discrimination with a limited means to combat the issue. The affirmatively furthering fair housing standard requires the government to promote greater opportunity and integration as well as fight discrimination. This mandate forces cities to take responsibility in actively alleviating the disparities between neighborhoods. Under the Trump administration in 2019, HUD announced 3 separate notices intended to indefinitely suspend the implementation of the AFFH, followed by proposed changes that would further roll back the intentions of the mandate. As of this past January, under the Trump administration, the HUD issued a rule proposal geared largely towards undermining the AFFH, one that would strip the expectation that communities should provide fair housing, thus weakening the fight against segregation and decreasing opportunities for those affected by discriminatory housing practices.
I will be discussing polarization within the Fair Housing Act. As mentioned earlier, discrimination within housing is personal as it deals with people's homes and where they are or are not able to live. Ezra Klein, a political scientist that wrote the book Why We're Polarized, makes the argument that the Democrats have become the party of the civil rights movement, and therefore polarization began with the civil rights movement when Democrats showed strong support towards racial equality as they held the majority in Congress and had the power to pass these bills. Ezra Klein states, the Democratic Party's embrace of the civil rights and the Republican Party's decision to unite behind a standard bearer who opposes the bill cleared way for the Southern conservatives to join the Republican Party, and that set the stage for all that followed. Whether or not polarization in other aspects began with the civil rights movement, it's important to acknowledge that racial equality has become a partisan issue. Furthermore, it is shown that, Furthermore, it is shown that throughout history, African Americans vote for Democrats to a higher degree than they vote for Republicans. This not only shows the divide within our country within the specific issues that each party puts on their agenda, but it shows the polarization that occurs as a result of people identifying issues with a specific party. 87% of Black voters identify with the Democratic Party compared to just 7% who identify as Republican or lead Republican in 2016, according to the Pew Research Center. Both graphs show voter demographics within African Americans, showing the margin at which they consistently vote Democrat. Republican presidents continuously roll back progress made by Democratic presidents in regards to the Fair Housing Act and other acts my classmates have discussed tonight. It only further divides between the country by political party. As well as this, the desire to roll back these acts might not exist if our nation was not polarized in the first place. The ability for Trump to utilize the polarization of political parties to roll back agenda made by a previous administration speaks to the differing beliefs within political parties, even in response to something such as race. Currently today, I believe, as Ezra Klein also discussed within his book, that polarization is successful because of identity politics, which race has embedded itself within, which is continuously shown by our current political climate and the issues going on as we speak. Race existing within someone's identity and racial equality existing within people's morals creates a stronger tie to a political party, allowing racial equality to become partisan and polarizing. As well as this, polarization as a result of racial equality continues from the anger caused by segregation within cities, as the Fair Housing Act was not successful at desegregating neighborhoods. The figure on the right shows that household and neighborhood inequality in these 4 cities have increased since the 80s. This has ultimately led to education inequality, healthcare inequality, and institutionalized discrimination caused by the failure of these acts and the polarization of our country, causing racial equality to remain a partisan issue. Therefore, it is left up to the current political system and administration to determine to what effect they will address these issues. Because of the partisanship determined by this polarization, the Fair Housing Act has remained stagnant and failed those who are hurt by the act's lack of success and the administration's failure to support progress for equality. To move towards a less polarized nation, acts that strive towards equality, such as the Fair Housing Act, must be properly enforced and continue to be enforced by all political parties.
And that's it.
Thanks so much, Group 4. We have had a question come in. So someone is asking, what role do you think the fact that we will become a majority country plays in the increasing conservatism of the Republican Party?
Well, oh, Simon, you can go ahead.
Oh, no, you can. I was just going to ask for maybe a little clarification on it, like increased conservatism.
I would guess that they're looking at the graph that you showed about how the Republican Party has changed through time in comparison to the Democratic Party, where the lines kind of crossed, and the increased polarization of both of our two major parties, and whether the fact that our country is on track to become majority minority in the future, if that may or may not have an effect on whether the Republican Party continues and becomes even more conservative.
Yeah, I know Ezra Klein discusses this in his book as well, but I think that it's definitely pushing people to become more conservative. I think a lot of people are scared of not being the majority anymore, and they feel sort of attacked in a way. And I think that has created this like pro-white rhetoric within Trump's campaign, and that has allowed him to become so successful in his campaign at sort of like gaining support by a lot of white people, and the Republican Party has become more and more white. So I think that definitely that is a big contribution.
Great, thank you, Emma. So at this point, I'm going to invite everyone to come back and join us. And we have had a question come in that was relevant to the presentation by group 3. So I'll go ahead and ask that now. So for those of you who are in that group, or if someone else wants to chime in, someone's asking, what are the options for Congress to draft a new law to address Section 4 to get around the Supreme Court's decision?
I can do my best at trying to answer that. I don't really know the legal logistics that it would require, but the one, and this may not be the answer the person who's asking is looking for, but the one thing I'm pessimistic about is that as we've kind of studied the civil rights movement, and especially up to today, a lot of the reasons we've seen progressive and meaningful policies, stop being effectuated or not be as positive as they can be, is because there is a lot of money in politics, and especially in Congress. When you look at the lobbying groups and stuff like that, I think that it would take quite a bit for Congress to take affirmative action towards repealing the Supreme Court decision, because such a decision may affect their bottom line and affect their funders and their lobbyists. And I hope someone else might be able to answer that better than I did, but.
Yeah, so going off of what you said, Dylan, part of the Supreme Court decision for repealing Section 4 was that it was the states that were being directly affected by the Voting Rights Act were decided during 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was passed, and they wanted those restrictions on changes in voting procedures to be based off of more accurate data. And so they said that Congress could go through and decide on a county by county basis where the need for federal oversight was. But like Dylan said, representatives in Congress are not really inclined to go through and do the work that would require, because it might affect their political future.
Thank you. So we have one more question, and this will kind of be sort of just an opinion question. Someone is asking what all of you as students who are now in our youngest voting generation, what you all think the prospects are for Democrats to take back the Senate in the 2020 election. No one wants to wager a guess.
I would personally say that the prospects of the Democrats taking the Senate in 2020 are slim. However, I think there's a very good chance, given what's going on now, and especially if we can sustain the activism that we've got going on now, I think there's a very good chance that, say, at the Democratic Convention this summer, that the entire party platform will be, rewritten and reintroduced as a civil rights, anti-police brutality, or at least police reform platform. And I think that if the activism continues, and if people are this involved for long enough this year, the Democrats could win more congressional elections, and there could be legislative progress, a second civil rights movement, if you will, maybe. But I think that whatever happens there, and things need to happen there, as we've seen, even parts of the existing acts are gone, and those need to come back in more. But even aside from that, activism needs to continue to happen to reform the system itself. And what needs to happen is that police departments across the country need to be defunded so that they're demilitarized. They need to be changed from a federal level. Even there needs to be intervention to make sure that not just that training happens effectively, but that the entire institution operates in a different way so that it satisfies its intended purpose.
Thanks, Aiden. I had a question just watching this whole presentation, and also reflecting on the photo that Simon showed. I believe it was Simon, of the protests in Portland from this week. And I'm wondering if anyone would like to comment on how your experience in this class and what you've learned and taken from participating in this class, whether you think that has impacted your reactions and response to the moment that we're in, like this week and today, and how that might have changed how you reacted.
I would say that I had a pretty good understanding of civil rights before taking this class, but learning from Professor Frank about something that's beyond ideology and systemic problems, but the actual rhetoric people use and the messages that they send either explicitly or implicitly through their words really taught me a lot about how to at least identify these kind of covert messages that our leaders or people who are fighting against our leaders are expressing. But one thing I've been thinking about a lot, and just in terms of what's going on in the world today, is that a lot of the attention is on rioters and looters, and I will be the last one to condone any violence or any looting or any robbery or theft. But there were protests when Trayvon Martin was killed. There were protests when Eric Garner was killed. Obviously not to the same magnitude, but you didn't really see much change after that. You still have police brutality, and you still have systemic racism in the system even after those protests. So, the JFK quote, it's like, when peaceful protest is not allowed, then violent protest is what you're expecting. And I definitely butchered that quote, but I fervently believe that.
Thank you, Dylan. We have time if just one more of you or one or two of you have a comment or an opinion you'd like to put out there. Okay, we'll go ahead and leave it there. So I would just like to express my thanks to all of you for participating in this program tonight. My sincere thank to you, Professor Frank, for reaching out to the museum and partnering with us to bring the work of your students to our public audience. And I'd also like to invite Dr. Pittard to come back for a moment. I believe she has a final thought to share with all of us.
Thank you so much, scholars, for reminding us of the civil rights movement, the dangerous rhetoric affiliated with that, and solutions that we must consider as part of that movement, as well as our movement happening now. Thank you, Professor Frank, for helping scholars highlight key civil rights outcomes, the war on poverty, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, in the Fair Housing Act. It's very interesting also to consider how history is indeed a light unto our feet and a lamp unto our path. Where do we go from here? Understanding too that our destinies are indeed intertwined. I very much appreciated being reminded of the key solutions that you highlight and think it's important to crystallize on how those are very relevant to now. Cultural competency training, racial reconciliation, self-work, difficult dialogues, adopting a new political system, considering our use of our language, unconscious discrimination and disrupting that, leveraging our voice at elections and in voting, advocacy, ongoing education, criminal justice reform, activism, coalition building, investing in social systems, and economic equality, to name a few. You know all too well that action matters. You have absolutely identified for us key priorities and opportunities to lead with Lace, which is exactly what we need. More love, authenticity, courage, and empathy. Thank you, be safe out there, and go Ducks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight. And we'll go ahead and leave it there. Thanks again.